Well, with me today, we're going to talk about, just kind of explore the different growth-related challenges that districts and counties are facing. We've already kind of heard a little bit about it in our panel on the S word yesterday. Some like potential problems and potential things that districts can do, but we're really going to dive into it a bit more today. And so with me to talk about this today, we have here on my right Scott Brooks, who is a director at the Clearwater Underground Conservation District in Bell County. Next to Scott, we have Mike Keester, who is a hydrogeologist with R.W. Harden and Associates. And then we have Lon Shell, who is a Hayes County Commissioner, and Bill Dugat, who serves as General Counsel for several groundwater conservation districts, and Michael Voulgaris, who is the General Manager at Cow Creek Groundwater Conservation District. And so I'm going to kick us off with a couple of slides. So this isn't anything new to any of us. We all know that population is growing in Texas. We see it in the news every single day. We're reminded of the impacts that it's having on our communities, our businesses, our infrastructure, and of course our water supplies. And we're seeing these impacts being exacerbated, especially this summer with drought situations. And I'm going to show some images from our state water plan, and you saw these yesterday from Jeff Walker's presentation. But the projected population growth between 2020 and 2070 is 70%, and that's those yellow bars off to the right. And this growth is happening mainly in the major metropolitan areas in the state. On the left, you see historical population change from 2010 to 2018, and you can see that focused in the metro areas, Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. And on the right, you see projected population growth continuing to occur in those metropolitan areas. But you're also seeing some population growth in traditionally rural areas, and also growth in the kind of regional metropolitan hubs in West Texas. And of course, with that growing population, we have increased water demands. And this is the projected annual water demand by water use category. That rising red dotted line is municipal water demand, which eventually surpasses irrigation demand, which is slowly declining. So we have more people, more water demands. A lot of these people are living in subdivisions that are being built pretty quickly. And everyone needs some groundwater, especially whenever we're going to be having more droughts. So what are we going to do about this? Micah, I have a question for you to start with, and this is a question for all my panelists, but I'll start with you. What kind of growth-related challenges are you seeing in Kendall County in your district as it relates to groundwater management?
Yeah, we're seeing that same high-density growth as everybody in Central Texas. A lot of our growth is driven by out-of-county water, so surface water from Canyon Lake or other sources of water that are coming into the county. But property rights issues, that balance test of highest practical use. You have the farmer who's lived there and the concrete batch plant who wants to go in next door and get a little bit of friction there. But and then it's all exacerbated by drought. So we're a real low production area, and just that high density development. So
thanks. We'll dive into that a little bit more later. But Lon, next question for you. You are in a county that has multiple districts overlaying it, and you're of course with the county. So what kind of challenges are you seeing in your role?
We see plenty. Most people know Hayes County's, in the last 10 years, been the fastest growing county in the country. Any given year, we're in the top five. I think Comal might have passed us up, which is good for us. I like to use the example of growth, not just population, but the value of the county, just development in general in Hayes County. Back in 2011, if you added up all of the taxable property in Hayes County, it would have been just under $11 billion. This year, during our budget process, we're over $35 billion. So in about a 10-year period of time, you see that type of growth, not just in population, but in development. And that development, a lot of it's been coming in western Hayes County, where we rely on groundwater, the Wimberley Valley area, Dripping Springs. Anybody that grew up in Hayes County, remember Dripping Springs as a very small town. Anybody that goes through there now on 290, for the most part, sees that as a suburb of Austin. And you mentioned the multiple groundwater conservation districts. We have the Edwards Aquifer Authority covering most of the county. We have the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District covering portions of western and northern Hayes County. We have the Hayes Trinity Groundwater Conservation District covering portions of western Hayes County. We have the Plum Creek Conservation District. So each of those districts created at different times in different eras with different rules, different funding mechanisms, causes much confusion. It is one of those things that I look across this room, and in Wimberley, Texas, which is still a pretty small place, if I wanted to have a meeting about water, this would probably be a pretty small turnout for us. And the room would probably be about a tenth of this size. But that's how important it is to us. And that growth is causing these greater concerns. Micah mentioned kind of that what citizens would consider incompatible uses, the concrete batch plant popping up next door. We're starting to see that now with types of land use that didn't occur before. Things like RV parks, where we have 10 acres, where that might have been one house, one well, and now we have an RV park with 100 to 200 RV spots in a public water supply coming from the Middle Trinity. So the growth is showing us things that we never imagined, and we're having to deal with them on a daily basis.
Well, hopefully we can get into talking about your creative solutions at the end of this. Scott, I imagine you're encountering some similar issues, and you're in kind of an interesting position because you work for, or you're a director of a district, but you're also a developer. So from those different perspectives, what kind of challenges do you see?
So the problem in Bell County that we're seeing, I think, that is most challenging, at least for the district, is that the price of land is going up so high, it's pushing development to the outskirts of the cities, because the developers are trying to respond to the need for housing that people can afford. They move to the outskirts of the cities and there's no water available. So then they start getting creative about how to get water there, forming muds, relying on groundwater. It's now starting to stress the aquifers in ways that we didn't imagine. And the other thing that we're challenged with is we're close to other counties and other districts, and even some counties that don't have districts, and not everybody manages the same way. So trying to cooperate and solve the problem together is what we're just starting to get into now.
All right. And Bill, you work with a lot of different types of districts. I understand you've worked with some rural districts who are seeing growth now, it's kind of surprising them, and urban districts as well, who are just having to deal with that ongoing population growth. So what kind of challenges do you see that pop up?
That's right, Natalie. In rural districts, what I'm seeing is folks say, we want a ranch in West Texas. And the way they define ranch is a little small piece of property. And so developers in West Texas have figured out that if they can put together a development that has a lot that's 10.01 acres, then they can manipulate around an exemption under Chapter 36, and people get their little ranches, but they don't have water on them. Because, again, and not trying to lump all these developers together, they're pretty smart, and there's not any, there is developing, but not widespread water availability certification for these subdivisions, which we'll talk about in a minute. So it becomes problematic that that you're seeing this, people being pushed, buying property in a naive way without any water. The other thing that's popped up out in rural West Texas districts is cryptocurrency mining. So I don't know exactly what that means. I've tried to study it on the internet, but there is a water component, and they like West Texas because there's lots of land that's relatively inexpensive. There's lots of electricity, and they think there's lots of water, and there is, but it takes a lot of water to cool these big digital mining facilities cool. So the problem is that they want to build it on a small track, and they want a lot of water, and so districts that have rules related to tract size or acreage, it doesn't work. In the urban settings, we're seeing the same thing with regard to subdivision development, but I think overarching in areas that are not as arid or haven't been as arid is the drought component. Drought is exacerbating the intensive growth that is occurring more than can be imagined that we're all experiencing.
Thanks. And Mike, last to you. You work with a lot of groundwater districts, and I imagine that a lot of your challenges are related to data and collecting data. And perhaps you could also talk a bit about the model subdivision rule that Bill alluded to, just briefly.
Sure. So to also kind of piggyback on one of the things that Bill alluded to there is, one of the challenges that we also run into with the management of the groundwater, whether it be in a district or outside of a district, is that development getting ahead of verifying that the groundwater is actually there and available to meet the projected demand of the development. So developing that data, that's part of the process of being able to get the information that we need in order to then go back to the developer, the district, the county, and develop that consensus among hydrogeologists that really, there really is that groundwater available to meet that projected demand. So essentially we need that science to help support those decisions. One of the ways that we do that is, of course, through the administrative code. It's got kind of some prescriptive language there for assessing the amount of groundwater that is available, and it's just one of the tools that we have to do that.
So these, what we're calling model subdivision rules, were something pretty new to me, and I just kind of learned about them. So I thought we could explain what those are. So Bill, would you mind explaining what model subdivision rules are and what kind of allowances are given to counties in the water code, local government code to kind of require these water availability studies?
Sure. There are, I guess, three categories of rules that counties and cities can adopt that relate to sustainability of water. Some of them, only one of them addresses surface water and groundwater. The rest deal with groundwater. But the model subdivision rules are in the Water Development Board rules, and they initially applied to all border counties. They were required to adopt model subdivision rules that address more than just water, but the water component, and then later, any county that sought or city that sought or had an entity within the county or city that sought EDAP funding, economically distressed area program funding, was required to adopt model subdivision rules. And then voluntarily, counties and cities can adopt these rules, but ultimately they address the availability of water that counties can and cities can adopt rules that we'll talk about more in detail. There are similar provisions in the water code and in the local government code. In the water code, we looked at chapter 35 of the water code, something we don't really look at much anymore, but there is a provision 35.019 that has some significant authority for counties to adopt a water sustainability ordinance that the county can look at its water supply and adopt rules that subdivisions that are required platting have to comply with that don't exceed the sustainability, that safe, sustainable yield that a county determines. Now, the catch on this is that it's only counties in a priority groundwater management area, so it's not a tool for every county. But the county can adopt these rules. They can use formulas and to enforce, and there has to be a certification that those subdivisions meet the sustainability rules. And Commissioner Shell may talk about more of this later, but Hayes is one of the preeminent counties that have used this. There's a provision in the local government code that, two provisions, one for cities and other counties that allow counties, any county, to require plats for subdivisions to have a certification by a PG or a PE that there's water available, and they have to submit a report and form that will be talked about more here in a moment of what is required in that report, and that has to be provided to the development board as well as the GCD. But that's an statutory overview what we've got.
Thank you. And Mike, you've worked on these groundwater availability certifications. So can you talk a little bit about what those entail, and is it enough?
Right. So, yeah, we've worked on several of these over the years with trying to go through the process of understanding the available groundwater to meet the prospective home buyers for the plat, for example. When we look at the administrative code there, it appears very prescriptive. There's quite a bit of information in there, a lot of things that are required. However, they aren't necessarily sufficient to be applied universally. So it requires that there's so much in there that it looks like you can just follow those rules and you've got everything down. However, there's some caveats in there, or essentially a caveat I'd like to place on is that not every aquifer is the same. Different areas are unique. Whether it's karst or a porous media, you may need to do different steps to assess groundwater availability. One of the things in the code there is that it talks about requiring a minimum of one test well and one observation well, and that others are only needed if it's practical or necessary to confirm the test results. But it's really up to the judgment, say, of the developer or the geoscientist working for the developer to determine if that's practical or necessary. Unless you get some cooperation, of course, with the county or the district. One of the challenges that we run into there is that sometimes the counties don't have the expertise to really understand what they need to look at to assess groundwater availability for, say, a 2,000-acre area or piece of land that's going to be cut up into 10-acre tracts, for example. So those are some of the things that we run into as far as challenges with the code. And the other thing that we could run into with it is that it only requires assessment of groundwater availability or certification for up to 30 years. And, the question then becomes, is 30 years enough? So.
Micah, have you used these and worked with your county to assess these groundwater availability certifications? What do you think about them, and are they enough?
Yes, ma'am. Our Kendall County has a water availability requirement. In the 20 years that I've been there, I've never seen one come back that says, nope, not enough water here. Try a different place. But I think that, a minimum requirement would be beneficial. I don't think that anywhere in the statute that says you have to be able to prove up, 5 gallons a minute, 2 gallons a minute, some minimum. And I think that really gets back to that professional geoscientist or engineer who says, yes, there's enough water here. Well, when we look at it, we say, okay, the test well made 2 gallons a minute. I mean, is that really enough to put in a subdivision with 100 homes or however many? And, if you can prove up 1/4 of a gallon a minute, that's 360 gallons per day, which, they can say, okay, 360 gallons a day is enough water for a household. So, I mean, I think it's good to have it there, but I think it needs more. It needs a threshold, for, okay, this is a minimum requirement to put in a subdivision. And I think that's going to vary across the state. I mean, a 10-gallon a minute well is a pretty good well in our district. And, I was on the waste committee and we were talking about vanity ponds and all that stuff. And, for a 10-gallon a minute well, that's a big deal. But in a lot of parts of the state, it's not an issue. So, yes, we deal with it.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, I imagine that you deal with them as well. What do you think about them?
The groundwater availability studies are only as good as the underlying data that they're based on. I think we had a good presentation yesterday on the importance of data. Our district, fortunately, long before I, was elected to the board, had been studying and gathering data putting it in a public platform. That data is available to, our consultant, Mike, and any of the consultants that are working for the developers that come before us for an application through the county plating process. We collaborate with the county. We have a very good collaborative relationship with the county, and they kind of lean on us for groundwater questions. And so it's only become recent that we've had really enough data to, I think, understand, certainly enough data to understand the aquifers enough to now propagate rule changes where we're setting up management areas because of the differing conditions in the aquifers. And the only reason we're able to do that is because we've got over a decade of data collection. So really it's the big stumbling block I see for using groundwater availability studies effectively is if all you have is just general information on aquifer conditions and parameters, it's pretty hard to manage that way.
Always need more data. So the role and authorities of counties and districts is confusing to me, and I would imagine it'd be confusing to others as well. So Lon, could you talk a bit about what kind of authorities that counties have in terms of groundwater management, and maybe what kind of authorities would be more helpful, or even what kind of cooperative efforts could be helpful?
Sure, and Bill mentioned Chapter 35 of the Water Code 35.019, and Hays County did use that to create our minimum lot size requirement in the PGMA, which is 6 acres, and so that's how we came up with, a 6-acre lot supported by one well would be reasonable. And I agree with Mike. I've never seen a water availability study come back, and we've had a lot done for a lot of subdivisions in Hays County that has ever said there's not enough water for that development. So, our rules are very important, and the authorities of counties is discussed every legislative session and amongst county commissioners and judges at every conference that we attend. And I don't know what that balance is. I don't know what is reasonable. I can just tell you in the fast-growing counties where I use Dripping Springs as an example. In Hays County, the city limits of Dripping Springs is very, very small. The population of the Dripping Springs area is very large. All of that development is occurring outside of the city limits and therefore regulated by the county only. Our rules can only go so far. For the most part, we regulate on-site wastewater treatment. That used to be the lot size, determining factor, how much land it took to treat the wastewater that you were going to dispose of on your property. Because of Chapter 35, we took that a little bit further in the PGMA, but beyond that, we have very basic rules. You can't construct something in the floodplain unless it's designed in a certain way. Access to a county road. We do have a fire code in Hays County that can get into some water type issues, but besides that, we really have no authority. There's no type of density authority, land use authority, and you hear people use the word zoning, like cities use, and I would never propose to say that counties should have zoning. I don't even know how that would be applied across the counties of the state of Texas. But there has to be some way for counties to plan for the type of growth that we're seeing that cannot be regulated within the city government. And I'm sure there'll be bills filed this session like there usually are. Usually they don't go very far, and I can understand that trepidation by some to give counties additional authority. Maybe it could be done by population, done near floodplains, maybe some greater authorities. We've seen dramatic flooding in the state of Texas. We don't want any right now, but we'd like to see some more rain. Those type of authorities, we have to come up with something because we all see where people want to live. They want to live in Texas. A lot of them want to live in Central Texas and Hays County, and to deal with that, we need a few more tools in our toolbox. We're trying to use everything we can. We're about to open up our rules and go through the process again. I'm sure most counties are like Hays County. We're not the most sophisticated governments that mankind ever created. And so it does take a while for us to get there and develop those levels of sophistication. We just need a little bit of help.
So you've got some limitations, and I imagine that groundwater districts also have a few limitations. So Micah, could you talk a bit about what kind of limitations GCDs encounter?
Yes, A lot of times we're treated as kind of the environmental protection agency for our county, and that's not where our authority lies. Kind of getting back to the rock crusher thing, the people living next door say, well, it's going to create more traffic. It's going to, our air quality is going to go down. And I'm like, not our issue, not our issue. We can't really help you with that. And I think it was yesterday or maybe this morning we talked a little bit about not being able to kind of pick winners and losers whenever we're issuing permits. So that's one of our issues. We have to look at everyone fair and impartially. A big issue that I see in our in the Hill Country area is the different enabling acts that created the districts. We get some grief sometimes from the legislature about not having I don't know what similar rules, and a lot of that is because of the enabling acts that created us. For example, in our district, we have a prohibition on ever putting any type of metering device on any domestic well, which is fine unless you have a domestic well that for some reason can make more than 25,000 gallons a day, or you start getting into that area where you have those minimum lot sizes, but you have to have the ability for someone to drill a well on a smaller tract size, and you say, okay, well, you can get an operating permit as a non-exempt well. Well, if they're using it for domestic, we can't meter it. So I know Hays County, Bexar County, they have some limitations in their enabling acts too, but those are real issues that we deal with. Also, for us, this high density growth that we have does contribute to poor water quality on the runoff side, and there's nothing in the water code that gives us the authority to really dig too deep in water quality. And then the alignment of our rules and the county rules is a constant limitation, who has the authority to do what. And then we have 4 or 5 different big utilities who their drought rules don't always line up with our drought rules. So, when we're telling everybody no watering outdoors, maybe the city of Bernie is in a different stage because they have 3 other water sources. So it can be confusing for people. But I would say, Chapter 36 water code districts that are true, don't have a whole lot of those limitations, do have the authority to do a lot of the things that we want to do. But we all have those different limitations in our enabling acts. So.
And you mentioned exempt wells, and for those of you who are not familiar with what exempt wells are, there are certain types of wells that are exempt from permitting in the state. And Bill, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about some of the challenges associated with that and exempt wells, and maybe a little bit about even drought restrictions and how they might apply to exempt wells versus other types.
So exempt wells present a challenge, and just reflecting back last century, Senate Bill 1, exempt wells were defined as wells that are on tracts, domestic and livestock exempt wells. I'm going to leave out the other ones. But DNL wells, they had to be located on tracts greater than 10 acres, used for domestic and livestock purposes, and pump less than 25,000 gallons per day. So Senator Bullock pushed that legislation because there's this proliferation of ranchettes everywhere, and we want 10-acre lots or greater. Well, now we have a proliferation of 10-acre ranchettes, and the problem with regulating exempt wells is that there's a provision in 36.117 that says domestic and livestock wells, thou shalt not limit their production. So that's the legal challenge, and like you were saying, you'll have a utility that has drought restrictions in place, and their customers have brown yards, and then across the road outside the subdivision or the utility's service area, you've got all these exempt well owners with green grass lots. So it's problematic for a district that gets called up and says, what do we do about that? And there's also a practical limitation that those wells that are not exempt, that are on small tracts, that you can require a permit because they're on a 1-acre tract or whatever. There's the practical limitation that there can be so many of those there's so few staff members to address it. If you're a fee-based district and you get pennies for a permit on a well of that size, you can't pay the cost from those wells to run a staff to police them. And so we can talk about some solutions in a minute, but that's the practical and legal limitations the groundwater district has with regard to exempt wells, and that includes drought. If we, addressing drought is all over the place with groundwater districts. Some have no drought rules, some have drought rules that are voluntary, and some have, significant drought rules with enforcement, but it becomes difficult, again, to do that, to use those rules with an exempt well.
Thank you. Y'all, I'm going to skip a couple of them and move to our last question in the interest of time so we can take some questions later. But I'd like to move on. We've talked about the limitations. We've talked about what tools are available. So my final question, and it's going to be for all of you, but I'll start. I'm going to start with you again, Bill, is what can districts or counties do to actually encourage efficient use of groundwater, and what might the work with landowners, property developers, anything like that, what might that look like?
Let me start with the subdivisions. I've got some districts that are working hand in hand with counties that the district is actually using their PG to review the groundwater certifications, and so there is some pushback on these certifications that, while they may pencil whip them and say water's available, when you really get down and analyze it, it's not. And so that's going to be the next threshold the counties and districts get to, is when there is a pushback on these certifications, what is the county going to do? And I think there is some enforcement authority there for counties. I've also seen districts, not all developers are bad, and so there's some districts that have worked with developers where the developers impose covenants on the development, on the size of, on the use of wells, either prohibiting them when they might otherwise be required by the groundwater district, or at least limiting their production, which a groundwater district might not otherwise be able to do. And while the district may not be able to enforce these covenants, the homeowners and association can, and so we'll see if that happens. With regard to these exempt wells and drought, really what is effective but not on large scale is just putting these exempt well owners into a guilt trip, but that takes one-on-one conversations with them by staff, and it's difficult to have enough time to deal with them. There might be an angle to address exempt wells under the waste definition, but that would be to cut them back. But it would be a test case, and there was a discussion yesterday about how can you manage if you can't measure, and if there's no production regulation, you certainly couldn't put a meter on that. Well, you might be able to put a meter on it, but that would be, again, a test case. But in connection with the wells that districts can regulate with regard to drought, I think that we can't ignore that the drought situation for districts that don't have anything other than in our management plan, we're going to monitor the drought index every quarter. So if you want to make enforceable drought rules, which you can, you have to start with the management plan because that's a management objective. And then you have to have rules that have teeth. And so that starts with developing the science as to what are the cutbacks, the trigger points that we have to require drought contingencies. You can require drought contingency plans in your permits and your permit applications. What kind of science do we have to back up that says we're going to cut back 10% or 20% or based on stream flow? You have to have the science so that it's defensible. The other thing is that districts, the only penalty provisions we have ultimately, unless you can do it by agreement, is to go to the court. I think the EAA is the only similar district that has administrative penalties like TCEQ where you don't have to go to court to impose them. And so ultimately, if you're going to impose penalties in court, and there are districts now with litigation to enforce, the issue becomes if you can assess a penalty on a daily basis, how do you know how much is being pumped or overpumped in violation of drought rules on a daily basis? Well, again, you can't do that, I don't think, unless you meter. And so I represent many districts that politically you can't require a meter, but at some point that threshold's going to be passed because drought's just going to overwhelm us with this growth.
Micah, what do meaningful drought rules look like to you and the metering aspect of things?
Well, we have adopted drought rules that we apply to all wells in the district. I mean, we consider the things that we list in our drought rules as continuation of those as waste. And we just kind of rank waste, when you're determining if something's waste or beneficial use, if it's one of these drought rules, it's waste. When you get over the 10 acres, it kind of becomes a gray area. So if you're in a subdivision and you're, on a 4 or 5 acre tract and you're just watering your grass every day, yes, we're going to go and do that face-to-face conversation. If you keep doing it, we're going to send you a letter. If you keep doing it, we're going to send you a fine. So we've gone through that process, and I'd say we have pretty good compliance, but there's always people who are just going to water through the drought. But on the metering side, we require meter on everything that's non-exempt. So, I don't know if every district can do that because of some of the limitations in their enabling legislation. But for us, it's not just important for us to know, but it helps the permittees know what they're using. It helps them. I think it's a more efficient way for them to see. It's a leak detection program. You get a lot of benefit from that, and then you also have those numbers to then plug into the model and say, here's where our pumping is. That's another big question is, where's the pumping in our county? I'm fairly confident when I say here's our pumping numbers for the county that they're accurate, So we work with property owners, homeowners associations. I go out and talk to homeowners associations all the time, and I used to go talk to all the 7th graders, but we're getting too many of those in the area for me to handle talking to thousands of kids every year. But we still try to, I'm going to the Ag Day where they bring all the kids in, and I might get 10 or 15 minutes with them. But, I think really that education aspect and starting early is really important. So,
Not only education for the youngins, but also for just your landowners, the people who you're metering and all that stuff to make them understand what that is. So, Lon, are y'all doing any kind of education efforts in that regard?
I mean, I think it's extremely important, educating, again, like the youth and the adults. And Bill mentioned, kind of guilting people into it. And I think it kind of takes that, just having communication with your fellow citizens, fellow landowners. We're all concerned about property rights, but try to explain that balance that there has to be. You don't really care until somebody on the other side of the fence start doing something that affects you, and then you start realizing that there are limitations, and maybe we should all work together. Science is huge. Hays County's invested over $500,000 in a modeling study with the Meadows Center at Texas State. I think Dr. Mace was here yesterday. We believe that's extremely important to help educate so that we can show people. And we see the arguments of science. It is a hard science, and I know nothing about it. I'm surrounded with people that actually know something up here. I fooling anybody if they think I know anything about groundwater. It is very hard to understand. And so the more science you have, I think the easier it will be to educate people. We had a situation in Hays County where an entity, before we had a groundwater conservation district over a certain area back in 2015, an entity came and leased some property to produce about 1 billion gallons of water a year. And they were actually going to send it from the west to the east, which was sort of the opposite of what had been happening. And at that point, that need for education and science became paramount. Our our communities then all of a sudden understood this is extremely important. I have a ranch. Next to that ranch, am I going to have water for my cattle, my goats? I live in a subdivision of 10-acre lots. Is my well going to still produce water? And if you don't have that science, it's very hard to get to the answer on that. And when there's someone telling you the opposite of what someone else is telling you, then it makes it even more confusing. And then it's hard. And I have friends who who live in a district where they put a meter on the well. It's not used or monitored or anything, and they refused to do it. And I call them my redneck friends. And they say, hey, I spent $30,000 on this well. I'm not putting a meter on here because I own the water now. And I understand that feeling. But also when you have this time of drought and all of a sudden they're running out of water, then they start paying a little bit more attention. That's where you take that opportunity. And I think as bad as this drought has been, it has been an opportunity to educate folks and explain the importance of conservation, and that as we continue to grow, these droughts are going to be more impactful. And we better be doing something in the interim, or we're going to be in trouble.
Mike, you are one of the scientists who knows about the groundwater stuff. So what does work with like developers? Because Lonnie, we're talking about just, neighbors, but what does work with developers look like in the science aspect of it?
So from the science aspect of it, working with the developers, we actually hope that we never get to the point that Bill was talking about earlier, where you have a groundwater availability certification that another reviewer or another hydrogeologist says that you don't agree with or doesn't agree with and can't support your opinion. We ran into that where we were working with in our work with Clearwater, where we were reviewing another groundwater availability certification that we just couldn't agree with it. So the same situation you were talking about there, Bill. So ideally, we would like to be on the front end working with these developers to work with them to assess what that groundwater availability is, determine it based on the test drilling, the science, our understanding of the aquifer system, what those well yields could be for an area, what the overall groundwater availability is for the area. And then the development plans are based on what's really there and what can be supported. So whether that be modifications or planning irrigation of landscape such that it doesn't exceed what can be provided from the aquifer in addition to what's being used in the homes, keeping that per capita usage down, making plans so that per capita usage is at a certain level to be supported. So that's what we foresee as at least the way we try to approach it in areas currently where we're working in some areas outside of districts with these developers to say, okay, don't get the cart before the horse, basically.
And Scott, in your mind, what are the best things that a district can do to kind of address all the issues? If you could sum it up in 3 things.
Well, the 3 things that we use, I think pretty effectively, are education, communication, and cooperation. Dirk Aaron, our general manager, and his staff are very good at that 3-pronged approach. They've been doing it for years. On the education side of things, we have a newsletter that we publish once a year that usually has informational items that are very broad-based, and that goes out to many constituents in the county. We also do an annual water symposium, which I'll plug right now. Dirk, what is that, November 16th in Bell County. We have a water symposium where we talk about water issues, and that's usually covered by the media, so our message gets out very effectively there. We also have a hands-on exhibit trailer that Dirk and his staff take all over the county to share with young and old, to try and explain what aquifers are and how they work and what's important about them. And then, of course, our website is just chock full of information. On the communication front, again, the website's the main way we communicate. That has a GIS platform on it that has a virtual well bore tool and all kinds of other things. So if landowners are wondering if, what's the availability of water under my property, they can go to our website and get that. And then emails and press releases are another big component of communication. And then cooperation. I mentioned earlier we have really good cooperation with the county on groundwater availability, but we also cooperate with well owners, consultants, the development community, the consultants that work for the development communities, and then the scientific community that we're using to help gather that data that we need to make good choices.
All right. Well, thank you, my entire panel, for exploring those issues. And I just want to mention that we were focused on Central Texas, but this is happening from my maps earlier all over the state, and they're just experiencing kind of different flavors. So hopefully this kind of gets the juices flowing on what some limitations are and potential solutions to those. So